May 8, 1972. The roar of gunfire shatters the sterile silence of the Sabina Flight 571. The crack of pistols echoing off the aluminum skin of the Boeing 707, a stark punctuation mark on the second day of the hostage standoff. Inside the pressurized cabin, 100 souls are trapped in a metallic cage, their fates hanging precariously in the balance. 4 masked figures, armed with the cold precision of trained killers, stalk the narrow aisles, their eyes scanning for any sign of defiance, their hands never straying far from the triggers of their weapons. The air is thick with a suffocating tension, a palpable fear that clings to the sweat-slicked skin and races in every terrified heartbeat. The fluorescent lights hum an incessant tune, reflecting off the polished metal of overhead compartments and the strained faces of the passengers. Among them, a mix of nationalities: Israeli citizens, European tourists, and weary businessmen, each wrestling with the shared dread of the unknown. Outside, beyond the reinforced door, the world is a blur of military vehicles, flashing lights, and the hushed urgency of Israeli negotiators desperately buying time. They are the guardians of a plan, a desperate gamble that promises either salvation or utter annihilation. They do not know that just beyond the fuselage, 16 men are preparing to transform themselves, to become something other, to walk a tightrope of deception and violence. The cabin is a pressure cooker. The air conditioning, once a luxury, now feels like a taunt, barely fighting off the oppressive heat. The stale smell of recycled air is laced with the metallic temps of fear and the acrid scent of sweat. Every creak of the plane, every whispered conversation, every shadow cast by the armed guards, ratchets up the tension. Passengers clutch rosaries, squeeze hands, and cast furtive glances at the masked figures patrolling the aisles. Each rhythmic footstep of the guards, a percussive beat of impending doom. The screams of children, silenced by parental hands, mingle with the silent prayers of adults, a cacophony of fear that amplifies the isolation of their confinement. The terrorists, their faces obscured by ski masks, move with a practiced efficiency, their movements honed by weeks of rigorous training. They bark orders in terse Arabic, their voices laced with a chilling authority. They seem unfazed by the growing despair of the hostages, their focus laser-like, their commitment absolute. 1. A woman with eyes that betray a chilling calm, her fingers dancing across the trigger of her pistol, monitors the cockpit, ensuring that the pilot, a man whose face bears the weary lines of a man trapped between duty and fear, follows their commands without question. The other 3, 2 men and a woman, prowl the cabin, their weapons a constant threat. Time becomes a cruel mistress, stretching and contracting in moments of agonizing uncertainty. The ticking of a wristwatch, the drip of condensation from a cold beverage, become deafening sounds. Each passing minute is a victory for the terrorists, a testament to their unwavering will. The world outside, the world of freedom, feels light years away, obscured by a shroud of anxiety. The hostages cling to the hope of rescue, the faintest flicker of belief that, against all odds, they will survive this ordeal. They know they must remain calm, obey the terrorists, and pray for the intervention of a miracle. But they also know, deep down, that the moment of truth is fast approaching. And when it comes, it will arrive with a violence that will irrevocably change the lives of everyone on board. The curtain rises on a tragedy, a play performed on a stage of metal and fear. Yaron squeezed the trigger, the 9mm round finding its mark. The terrorists' heads snapping back in a crimson explosion even before the sound of the gunshot echoed in the confined space, solidifying a moment that would change his life forever. The air in the training facility was thick with the scent of cordite and sweat. The concrete walls, stained with countless practice rounds, seemed to hum with the energy of controlled violence. It was a replica of the Boeing 777, down to the cramped, echoing passageways and the stale recycled air. Yaron, a lean, wiry man with eyes that missed nothing, wiped a bead of sweat from his brow. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic rhythm against the simulated roar of the aircraft engines. He wasn't just a soldier. He was an actor, playing a deadly part in a high-stakes drama. He moved with a dancer's grace, honed over months of rigorous training. Every movement was precise, every muscle memory perfected. He was a chameleon, expected to blend seamlessly into the hostile environment, a wolf in sheep's clothing. His team, a hand-picked cadre of the Sirat Matkal's finest, were his family, bound together by the shared understanding of the mission's deadly implications. They had spent weeks, months even, perfecting their roles. Again, barked Berok, the team commander, his voice a low growl that cut through the tension. Repeat the sequence. Yaren and his team snapped back into formation, their white jumpsuits a stark contrast against the grey backdrop. The simulated cabin was their stage, the terrorists their audience. He knew his character. The unflappable aircraft mechanic. The one who could talk shop with the flight crew. The one the terrorists wouldn't suspect of having a hidden agenda. His toolbox was a prop, concealing the deadly tools of his trade. He ran his hands along the metal case, feeling the familiar weight of the weapons within. The training was brutal, designed to strip away fear and doubt. They'd practiced the entry 1,000 times, the rapid infiltration, the careful maneuvering, the instantaneous assessment of the threat. They learned to move in the shadows, to read the body language of their targets, to anticipate their every move. They rehearsed the drill over and over until the plan became instinct, their movements as familiar as breathing. Their instructors, grizzled veterans of countless covert operations, drilled them relentlessly on the technical aspects of the mission. They learned the intricacies of the 707's ventilation systems, the exact location of critical components, the jargon of aircraft maintenance. They were expected to be conversant with the engineering and mechanics of the aircraft, their knowledge as essential as their combat skills. He remembered the first time he'd handled the Glock 17, the weight of the steel in his hand. The instructors had taught him the deadly art of close-quarters combat, the precision required to take down an enemy without harming the innocent. Each training session was a study in controlled violence. They'd spent hours on the firing range, honing their skills, until the weapon became an extension of his arm. He practiced drawing and firing from concealment, the practiced movements becoming as automatic as a heartbeat. The target practice with live ammunition served as an important lesson for Yaren on how deadly these weapons are. The drills were designed to simulate the chaos and unpredictability of the real world. They faced simulated hostages, screaming and panicked. They fought against opponents who were armed and dangerous. They learned to make split-second decisions under immense pressure, to remain calm and focused when everything around them threatened to collapse. Remember, Barak had said, his voice dropping to a near whisper during one training session, the best soldier is the one who knows when to be invisible. That was the creed they had to live by. To be invisible, to disappear into the background. To become part of the very scenery that defined the enemy's world. He knew this mantra would be the key to their success. It was the only way to get close enough to strike. And strike, they would. The silence shattered as the first shots rang out inside the plane. The illusion of mechanical inspection dissolving into a whirlwind of gunfire and screams, leaving the meticulously crafted deception of Operation Isotope in tatters. The briefing room was a sterile space, the air thick with cigarette smoke and the scent of strong coffee. Maps of the Sabina Flight 571, its trajectory, its current position. Plastered the walls, covered in complex calculations and color-coded notations. Ahud Barak, the mission commander, stood at the head of the table, his face a mask of focused intensity. Around him, the 16 commandos, including Yaren, sat in rapt attention, absorbing every detail, every contingency. Their mission, infiltrate the hijacked Boeing 707 disguised as maintenance personnel. Neutralize the terrorists and rescue the hostages. A seemingly impossible task. Yaren ran his fingers over the diagrams, tracing the routes, memorizing the positions of the 4 terrorists. He felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. The success of the operation hinged not on brute force, but on the delicate art of deception. Their disguise had to be flawless, their movements precise, their knowledge of the aircraft systems impeccable. They would become actors in a deadly play, where a single misstep could mean death. The Mossad had meticulously planned every facet of the operation, leaving nothing to chance. Intelligence reports had painted a detailed portrait of the 4 terrorists. Their personalities, their habits, their weaknesses. The Mossad psychologists had predicted their behavior in a crisis, their likely reactions to various scenarios. This information was crucial. It would guide the commandos in crafting a believable narrative, a plausible explanation for their presence on board. The key was the air conditioning system. The Mossad, working with engineers from the Sabina, had fabricated a specific, technical fault. A problem with the pressurization system, they claimed, which needed urgent attention. A problem that, if left unaddressed, would make the aircraft uninhabitable. The urgency was critical. It would push the terrorists to allow the supposed mechanics to board. Yet, the problem wasn't immediately catastrophic, creating a window of opportunity to gain access. The training was brutal, relentless. Days were spent in mock-ups of the Boeing 707, rehearsing the mechanics of the operation. The commandos practiced their roles, becoming fluent in the jargon of aircraft maintenance, learning to discuss the intricate details of the air conditioning system and the intricacies of its mechanisms. They learned to walk like mechanics, to talk like mechanics, even to smell like mechanics, inhaling the faint metallic scent of oil and grease that clung to their borrowed white jumpsuit. Yaron spent hours memorizing the layout of the plane, studying photos, and making his own detailed diagrams of the cabin, the cockpit, and the location of the terrorists. He knew where each person would be. His role was to take down the terrorists in the front of the plane. They were all set to make their move after a signal was given. Weapons training was equally demanding. Each commando would carry a suppressed pistol. The goal was to take down the terrorists in a single, well-aimed shot. They practiced drawing their weapons, aiming, and firing, again and again, until it became instinctive. Every movement, every action, had to be precise, flawless. Hesitation would be fatal. The entire operation had to be a meticulously choreographed dance, a delicate balance between deception and aggression. It would be a performance, a play. And for Yaron and his comrades, the stakes were higher than they could ever imagine. In the confines of the hijacked Boeing 707, the curtain was about to rise, and the world would watch. The stench of fear, sharp and metallic, clung to the humid air inside the hangar. A smell that would forever be seared into Yaron's memory, as the first of them pulled the white jumpsuits over their combat fatigues, transforming themselves into something other than soldiers. The fluorescent lights of the hangar buzzed overhead, casting long stark shadows across the concrete floor. The air conditioning fought a losing battle against the rising tide of adrenaline and apprehension. Yaron, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs, ran a hand over his freshly shaved head, feeling the stubble prickle. He looked at the faces around him, the hardened expressions of his comrades, each one a mirror reflecting his own anxiety. They were men of action, trained to kill, but tonight, they were playing a role, a dangerous charade where a single misstep could mean death for dozens. The white jumpsuits, fresh from a Sabina maintenance depot, were crisp and starched, smelling faintly of detergent and oil. They were the costumes, the masks they would wear to deceive, to gain entry, to get close enough to strike. Yaron meticulously checked his own, smoothing out a phantom wrinkle, a nervous tick. He felt the weight of the Glock hidden in his toolkit, its smooth metal cool against his palm. He'd practiced the draw 100 times. The seamless transition from mechanic to killer, a ballet of controlled violence, yet doubt flickered in the corners of his mind. They were a team, a well-oiled machine of death and deception, yet within each man was an isolated dread. He and the others had spent weeks training, learning the layout of the aircraft, the intricacies of the ventilation systems, the jargon of the mechanics. They'd rehearsed their roles until they were second nature. Their movements synchronized, their lines delivered with a practiced ease. But no amount of preparation could fully prepare them for the reality of the moment when they would confront the terrorists, when they would have to execute with precision and without hesitation. The final run-through was a whirlwind of activity. A frantic review of the plan. Ahud Barok, their commander, a man of ice and steel, reiterated the mission parameters, the unwavering necessity for speed and accuracy. Remember, his voice was low, laced with the steel of command. Every second counts. Every movement is judged. Trust your training, trust your instincts, and above all, trust each other. Yaren adjusted the straps of his combat boots, feeling the familiar weight of the webbing against his back. He checked the magazine of his pistol, feeling the reassuring click as he locked it in place. He ran his hand over the handle of his wrench. The cold metal, a grounding presence. The air in the hangar thickened. The scent of fear intensified. He closed his eyes for a moment, picturing the faces of the hostages, the innocent lives that depended on their success. This was not war in the desert, or a skirmish in the mountains. This was a stage. This would be a performance where everything depended on timing, on deceit, on the ability to walk the tightrope between life and death, under the constant threat of a deadly fall. The sweat, cold and clammy, plastered itself to Yaren's back. A chilling premonition of the bullets to come. Though only a handful knew the precise moment the world would explode into violence. The clock on the wall of the makeshift briefing room ticked, each second a hammer blow against the fragile piece holding on the tarmac. Outside, the harsh glare of floodlights carved shadows from the approaching night, illuminating the Boeing 707 like a morbid stage. It was a play everyone knew the ending to, but no one could predict the nuances of the performance. Inside the room, the air hung thick with stale coffee and the electric hum of anticipation. Maps were spread across tables, diagrams of the aircraft dissected with surgical precision, the white jumpsuits of the assault team laid out like cadaver gowns. Yaren ran a hand over his own, the cheap fabric offering little comfort. He could feel the weight of the silenced pistol, tucked into the toolbox, a secret promise of steel. The room was a symphony of nervous energy, hushed whispers. The clatter of dropped equipment, the rhythmic pacing of men trying to exorcise the ghosts of fear. The Israeli negotiators were playing their part, buying time, spinning out the charade of talks, trying to keep the terrorists occupied. The airwaves crackled with their voices, a dance of coded language and feigned concessions, each phrase a brushstroke on the canvas of deception. They were the puppeteers, and the assault team, the marionettes, poised to leap into the fray. Every delay, every averted demand, brought them closer to the moment of truth. Yaren found himself staring out the window, his gaze drawn to the plane, a metallic predator surrounded by a cordon of soldiers and vehicles. He focused on the details. The dirt smudges on the fuselage. The weary expressions of the hostages visible through the windows. The stark contrast between the darkness of the fuselage and the harsh, unwavering light. He imagined the terrorists within, their faces etched with desperation, their fingers twitching around the triggers of their weapons. They were actors too, playing their roles, oblivious to the fact that their stage was about to be stormed. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to control the knot of anxiety that was twisting in his stomach. He was a soldier, trained to follow orders, to suppress fear, to execute the mission without hesitation. But he was also a man, and the weight of the lives entrusted to him was a burden. He thought of his family, the faces of his comrades. He took a deep breath and focused on his training. He recalled the countless drills, the precise movements, the unwavering discipline. Then, a sudden buzz broke through the cacophony. A signal, subtle yet decisive, the first domino to fall. A call for his team. The moment had arrived. The time for rehearsals was over. The actors were about to take the stage, guns drawn and ready to perform the last act of the tragedy. He could feel the adrenaline beginning to surge, a current of electricity coursing through his veins, the anticipation morphing into a cold, hard clarity. They had the script, the costumes, the weapons. Now, it was time for the performance. He glanced at the others, saw the same steely resolve mirrored in their eyes. They moved as one, men transformed from soldiers into shadows of the night. Their true work began. As the first commando touched the door handle, he knew this was it, the moment when months of preparation would be measured in heartbeats. the deception unraveling in an instant if a single flicker of doubt crossed the terrorist's eye. The sun beat down on the tarmac, reflecting harshly off the polished fuselage of the Sabina flight. Dust devils danced in the distance, but around the plane, the air hung heavy with the scent of jet fuel and the metallic temps of fear. 16 men in white jumpsuits, each a shadow of the mechanic they pretended to be, moved with a practiced ease, their toolboxes swaying rhythmically. But inside those cases, hidden beneath the deceptive guise of wrenches and screwdrivers, lay the means of instant, brutal violence. Yaren's throat tightened, a familiar sensation he'd trained to ignore. The sweat under his borrowed jumpsuit felt clammy, sticking the fabric to his skin. He took a slow breath, the air thick with the smell of the plane itself, the stale, recirculated air, the faint aroma of coffee still clinging to the carpet. The undercurrent of something acrid, a metallic tension that spoke of the danger within. They approached the aircraft, a silent ballet of calculated movements. The illusion had to be perfect. One wrong gesture, one averted glance, and the carefully constructed facade would shatter. The terrorists were watching, peering out from behind the tinted windows like wary predators. He glanced at his watch. The signal was expected any minute now. He fought to steady his breathing, to keep the tremor from his hands. This was a play, a meticulously crafted drama with life and death as the ultimate stakes. He imagined the interior of the plane, the terror in the eyes of the hostages, the cold calculation of the terrorists. It was a pressure cooker, ready to explode. He focused on the present, on the precise movements required to complete the deception. As they reached the aircraft, a figure appeared in the doorway, a woman. She was one of the terrorists, her face a mask of suspicion, her eyes scanning each man. Yaren met her gaze, forcing a smile that felt unnatural, his heart hammering against his ribs. She gestured to them, her pistol glinting in the harsh sunlight. The inspection began, each commando submitting to a perfunctory search. Yaren knew his turn would be soon. He willed his hands to be steady, his face to remain placid. He could feel the eyes of his comrades, each one a mirror of his own tension. He felt the woman's hand on his arm, the cold metal of her touch. He braced himself, aware of the weapon concealed in his toolbox, a tool designed not for repair, but for swift and decisive action. Her fingers brushed against the fabric of his jumpsuit. He saw the cold focus in her eyes, the same predatory glint he saw in his own reflection. Would she find it? Would she sense the lie? The waiting was the worst part, this agonizing limbo between deception and action. He could feel the blood thrumming in his ears, a relentless drumbeat that threatened to drown out the world. Then, she released him, and he took a step inside, carrying his toolbox, carrying the weight of a mission, and the promise of violent liberation. The barrel of the gun, a steel promise of violence, pressed cold and insistent against Yaren's temple. He could feel the fine hairs on his skin stand on end, a primal reaction to the imminent threat, a stark warning against betrayal. The air inside the Boeing 707 was thick, a humid stew of fear, stale coffee, and the cloying scent of cheap perfume. The fluorescent lights hummed, casting a sickly yellow glow on the cramped space. He could see the dust motes dancing in the beams, illuminated like tiny frantic stars. His heart hammered against his ribs, a relentless drumbeat against the silence of the moment. He tried to control his breathing, to keep it slow and even, but it was a futile exercise. The pulse in his throat hammered a frantic rhythm. He was standing directly in front of Therese Holzer, her eyes, dark and glittering, locked onto his. Her lips were pulled back in a thin, humorless line, a mirror of the gun's cold authority. He imagined the taste of gunsmoke, the metallic temps of blood, the scream that might fill the air, a final desperate sound to the end of all things. Holzer's gaze was relentless, dissecting him. He could almost feel her mental scrutiny, measuring his every micro-expression. He was aware that her nostrils were flaring slightly, like those of a predator about to strike. He could feel the sweat beading on his forehead, trickling down his temples, threatening to betray his carefully constructed facade. He willed the sweat to freeze, to vanish, to prevent its descent that might betray him. The white jumpsuit, the very symbol of their deceit, felt heavy, constricting, as if it was slowly closing in on him. He focused on the small, almost insignificant details. The way the worn metal of Holz's pistol glinted under the harsh light. The slight tremor in her hand, the way a dark strand of hair had escaped the confines of her hijab, falling across her cheek. Any one of these small details could betray him. He was relying on the decades of training, the hours of rehearsal, on the unwavering belief of the team. He was playing the part of a mechanic, a man concerned with the mundane problems of pressurized air and faulty hydraulics. He felt the rough grip of Halse's gloved hand on his shoulder as she patted him down. He could feel the slight pressure as she checked his toolbox. His tools, his keys, his carefully concealed weapon. A lump formed in his throat, threatening to choke him. He swallowed hard, forcing the muscles in his jaw to relax, attempting to appear as if he was merely annoyed at the intrusion. He had memorized the weight of the tools, the specific locations within the toolbox. Everything had to be perfect. Halse's eyes flicked to the other mechanics standing behind him, their faces impassive beneath the strain. They were all playing their roles flawlessly. The scene they enacted was so real, the actors so skilled, that even they were beginning to believe it themselves. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Halse stepped back. She lowered her pistol slightly, the tension in her posture easing ever so slightly. "Enter," she hissed, her voice raspy, laced with suspicion. "But move quickly, and touch nothing except the equipment." Yaron nodded, his throat suddenly dry. The gate was open. He took a slow breath and stepped inside the belly of the beast. The pressure valve of life and death, the weight of 100 souls hanging in the balance, resting squarely on his shoulders. He was committed. The act was about to begin. The whir of the air conditioning, a sound that had moments earlier felt like a death knell, now became a strangely comforting lullaby, the only sound accompanying the rapid thud of Yaron's own heart against his ribs. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if wading through thick molasses, his eyes scanning the cabin. Above, the overhead panels seemed to press down on him, and the metallic temps of fear mixed with the stale recirculated air. His white jumpsuit, once a symbol of disguise, now felt like a second skin, a constricting shell that both shielded and burdened him. He was a mechanic. He repeated the words in his mind, a mantra to solidify his facade. Mechanic. Not a soldier, not a killer, not a man about to unleash a storm of violence in this confined, pressurized metal tube. He kept his gaze averted from the hostages. Their faces, etched with a mixture of terror and weary hope, were a distraction he couldn't afford. Instead, he focused on the air vents, the conduits, the intricate web of wires and pipes that crisscrossed the ceiling. He ran his hand along the cool metal, as if assessing a problem, a subtle act of camouflage. He'd rehearsed this 1,000 times. The walk, the posture, the casual nods to his comrades as they moved through the cabin. Every gesture was designed to blend in, to lull the terrorists into a false sense of security. He glanced at the two women seated near the rear. Their eyes followed him with a keen intensity, their expressions unreadable. They held their hands casually on their laps, but he knew the weapons were there, hidden, like coiled vipers waiting to strike. The air inside the aircraft seemed to thicken with each passing second. The scent of fear, mingled with the faint aroma of stale coffee and airline food, clung to the air. He could feel the eyes of the hostages on him, a silent chorus of desperate prayers and unspoken pleas. They were all dependent on him, on the team, on this deception. He was the most exposed. He was close to them, their guard dogs, their protectors. They would watch his actions. He walked past the hostages, nodding in a friendly way, almost a smile, hoping that his expression conveyed the right message. The message of safety, of everything being all right, the message that would give them hope. He saw the looks of those people, and how they trusted him. They were all depending on him. He could almost feel a tear in his eye, but quickly collected himself. It was showtime. He bent down, feigning interest in an overhead panel. He tapped it with his wrench, muttering something about a faulty pressure sensor, a meaningless technicality designed to appease the terrorists. His heart hammered against his ribs. He felt a bead of sweat trickle down his temple, but he dared not wipe it away. He looked up, his gaze meeting that of one of the women. Her eyes narrowed slightly, as if searching for something, a tell, a flicker of doubt. For a fraction of a second, he feared he'd been found out. But then, she turned away, her attention shifting to a nervous glance at the flight attendants. Complacency was a powerful tool, he realized. They had been in this situation for a long time. The tension was making them tired. He moved on, his steps measured, his focus unwavering. He had to reach the other end of the cabin, to position himself perfectly, to be ready when the moment came. The moment when the mechanics vanished, and the soldiers emerged. The moment when the illusion shattered, and the true purpose of the white jumpsuits was revealed. And when it did, it would happen fast, with no time to be afraid. The whir of the air conditioning unit, a broken promise of cool, was the soundtrack to their false sense of security. 24 hours. 24 hours of confinement, of demands unmet, of a steadily dwindling hope. 24 hours, and in the space of a heartbeat, it would all be over. For the terrorists, the day had bled into a weary haze of paranoia and exhaustion. They'd paced the narrow aisles of the cabin. Their vigilance, at first sharp and unwavering, had softened. The sharp edges of fear had dulled, worn smooth by the relentless grind of time. They moved now with a distracted lethargy, the pistol grips of their weapons no longer clutched as tightly, their eyes losing their focus. Therese Holzer, the woman who had inspected Yeren at the door, moved with a practiced arrogance, her movements now reflecting a certain complacency. She had dismissed the mechanics, a group of men in white jumpsuits carrying tools, as an inconvenience, a necessary evil. They were a momentary distraction in a world of demands and delays. Alitara, the senior of the two men, still kept a sharper eye on the cockpit. But even his gaze seemed to flicker less, his focus diluted by fatigue and the pressure of the situation. They'd been given food, water, cigarettes. A semblance of routine had begun to settle over the chaos. Yaren felt the slick sweat of tension between his palms. He knelt before the air conditioning panel, the metallic scent of his toolbox a familiar mask against the sharp sting of fear. His hands, though seemingly occupied, were ready. Every muscle in his body was coiled, a tightly sprung trap. He studied the panel, the way the screws glinted under the harsh fluorescent lights, the faint hum of the failing system. He listened to the rhythmic thrum of the engines, the metallic groan of the airframe, the constant hiss of pressurized air. His eyes shifted from the faulty system to the terrorists, their movements, the way they stood, and the way they looked. The man Alitara leaned against the galley, taking a drag from a cigarette. His back partially turned, the edge of his weapon just visible. He was vulnerable. Rimitanes, the other woman, sat in a seat near the front of the plane, and she watched the mechanics with narrowed eyes, her hand resting casually on the weapon in her lap. The other terrorist remained in the cockpit with the pilots, his focus intent on the world outside, never taking his eyes away from the landscape. She was a coiled spring, ready to react. But even she had relaxed, subtly, unknowingly. The cabin was a pressure cooker, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee, desperation, and the imminent arrival of the storm. The passengers, for their part, watched the mechanics with an emotion he could not name. Hopelessness, hope, they knew, though perhaps not consciously, that they were now in the eye of the storm. They sensed the shift in the balance, the subtle change in the air. The unspoken understanding, the shared breath held in anticipation. He looked at their faces, etched with the lines of fear, their eyes wide with a desperate, unspoken plea. He could taste the adrenaline, the metallic temps of it in his mouth. He could feel his heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. It was almost time. The comfort zone. They were in the place where it felt safe. A false sense of security had been achieved. The silence shattered, not with a bang, but with a guttural bark, the single, clipped word that would forever echo in Yaren's memory: execute. The humid air inside the Sabina flight, thick with the stale scent of fear and recycled oxygen, crackled with a sudden electric tension. For hours, The commandos had moved with the deliberate pace of repairmen, their white jumpsuits blending them into the mundane. Now, everything shifted. The illusion cracked, and the world narrowed to a tunnel of focused intent. Yaren's heart, which had been a steady drumbeat, now hammered against his ribs, a frantic rhythm against the backdrop of an impending storm. The sweat on his palms slicked the grip of his pistol, a cold counterpoint to the heat that flooded his veins. He tasted the metallic temps of adrenaline, the acrid, familiar taste of impending violence. His eyes darted, assessing. The terrorist, Therese Halser, stood at the front of the plane, a pistol casually held, her face impassive. Her eyes, however, betrayed the slight twitch of a muscle, a flicker of unease beneath the veneer of composure. Had she sensed the shift? Did she suspect? Time seemed to stretch, each second a year, as Yaren locked eyes with his team. He saw the same focused intensity reflected in their faces, the masked determination that separated them from the ordinary. He had rehearsed this moment countless times, in mock-ups of the cabin. Under the watchful eyes of their commander, Ahud Barak, he knew the precise angle of the shot, the way the bullet would enter. The devastating impact that would leave Halser unable to react. His breath hitched in his throat, and he swallowed hard to quiet his dry mouth. This was not a drill. This was life and death. The lives of hostages, the success of the mission, all hung on the next few heartbeats. His gaze swept over the trapped passengers, their faces a mixture of fear, resignation, and, in a few desperate eyes, a flicker of understanding. He saw the silent pleas for mercy, the unspoken hope that someone, anyone, would save them. The responsibility was almost crushing, an impossible weight resting on his young shoulders. The air conditioning hummed, a monotonous drone that was abruptly overlaid by a series of thoughts that were not his own, each one screaming about the terror of death and the inevitability of this moment. His hand tightened around the handle of his toolbox, a seemingly innocuous container that concealed the instrument of their deadly plan. His fingers traced the familiar contours of the grip, a silent reassurance in the face of the unknown. He knew the instant he moved, the scene would erupt into a chaotic ballet of violence. The precise choreography he and his team had practiced would take over. There would be no room for error, no second chances. Then, the world imploded. The metallic tang of fear, a taste familiar to Yaren after weeks of training, suddenly intensified into a suffocating presence as the command ripped through the false serenity. One moment, they were mechanics. The next, a ballet of death commenced. The air, thick with the smell of jet fuel and sweat, crackled with the staccato bursts of gunfire. Yaren had rehearsed the movements 1,000 times, each muscle memory locked, primed for this moment. His hand, already inside his toolcase, closed around the cold steel grip of the silenced pistol. He saw the flicker of surprise in Therese Halser's eyes, her hand moving towards her own weapon, but it was too late. He raised the pistol, the barrel steady, and fired. The bullet found its mark, a small dark blossom blooming on her forehead as she was instantly gone. Simultaneously, the other commandos in the passenger cabin unleashed their fury. Bullets ripped through the confined space, the screams of the hostages instantly muffled by the roar of the guns. Bodies were falling, a grotesque dance of death as the terrorists were cut down with ruthless efficiency. Yaren saw one of the male terrorists, whose name he never knew, lurching towards the cockpit, clutching a grenade. Before he could raise the weapon, another commando dropped him, a single shot to the chest. The chaos lasted only seconds, a whirlwind of adrenaline and violence. The air filled with the acrid scent of gunpowder and the metallic coppery scent of blood. The hostages, frozen in terror, were now witnessing a level of violence that none of them could have imagined a few moments ago. Yaren, his senses heightened, his heart pounding in his chest, scanned the cabin. All targets were neutralized. All guns were silent. The roar of the automatic weapons faded. An eerie silence descended, broken only by the whimpers of the hostages and the heavy breaths of the commandos. Yaren lowered his weapon, his hands still trembling slightly. The image of Therese Halser, the terrorist he had killed, lying motionless on the ground, flooded his vision. Her vacant eyes stared back at him. Her weapon lay discarded on the floor. The promise of death she had held so close now, a twisted irony. Yaren felt a wave of nausea, quickly suppressed. He knew they had no time for remorse, no time to fall apart. The mission wasn't over. There was still much to do. They had done what they came to do. Now, they had to ensure the hostages were safe, and that no other threats remained. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He focused on the task at hand, his training kicking back in. "Clear the area," he barked, his voice hoarse but steady. "Check for remaining threats." The other commandos moved. Their movements, sharp and efficient, their faces set in expressions of grim determination. They checked the bodies, secured the cabin, and scanned every corner of the aircraft for any remaining danger. The white jumpsuits, once a symbol of deception, were now stained with blood, a gruesome reminder of the battle that had just been fought. The air conditioning, still humming, began to push away the acrid odor. But the memory of the violence, the echoes of the shots fired, would not be so easily dissipated. The act was done. The world exploded in a silent symphony of gunfire, a burst of controlled violence that shattered the tense stalemate within the Sabina flight. The mechanics were gone, replaced by a storm of aggression, their white coveralls now stained crimson. I saw, in the briefest of glimpses, a muzzle flash. The vacant surprise on Alatara's face, a look that quickly transformed into an absence as his life was abruptly and permanently extinguished. The air, moments before thick with dread, was now sharp with the metallic temps of blood and the acrid scent of burnt gunpowder. My hand still gripped the pistol, the weapon now cool and lifeless in my grip, its purpose fulfilled. I was dimly aware of the sound of my own ragged breaths, a frantic rhythm matching the pounding of my heart. The cabin was a tableau of frozen terror, hostages paralyzed, their faces a mask of shock and disbelief. The two female terrorists were down, sprawled in a grotesque parody of repose. Their weapons, once the instruments of their savage will, lay abandoned on the floor. I saw Netanyahu, his face a granite mask, barking orders, his voice a disembodied command in the sudden quiet. The smell of smoke stung my eyes. I could hear the Captain Levy's desperate commands, his voice rising in an urgent plea over the din of the chaos. The world was spinning. A cacophony of sound assaulted my ears, shouts, gasps, the terrified whimpers of those around me. Each detail was hyperreal, sharpened by the adrenaline that flooded my system. My fingers still tingled, the phantom weight of the weapon still heavy in my hand. I swept my gaze across the cabin, scanning for threats, looking for the telltale glint of a remaining weapon. The reality of what we had done crashed over me like a physical blow. We had killed, we had taken lives, ended them with cold precision. Guilt threatened to overwhelm me, but duty pushed it aside. The mission was not complete. The hostages remained, and they needed to be removed. Netanyahu's voice cut through my thoughts. "Evacuate. Get them out." The command was a starting gun. We moved, our movements now automatic, our training taking over. The world blurred as we began the evacuation. Our primary task was to get the hostages out as quickly as possible, away from the scene of the violence. The emergency exits, once symbols of hope, became gateways to freedom. We ripped open the doors, deploying the slides. The sound of the metal worry into place, a jarring counterpoint to the weeping and moaning of the passengers. I saw them then, faces transformed, relief and terror mingled in their expressions. Some were screaming, others were utterly silent. There was a young woman, her face pale, tears streaming down her cheeks, staring at the corpses of the terrorists, her face a mask of utter horror. I met her gaze, and gave a slight shake of the head. I was a mechanic, no longer. There were no words. She understood. The first of the hostages began to move, stumbling and jostling their way towards the escape routes. The air outside was cool and clean, a stark contrast to the fetid atmosphere within the plane. I forced myself to focus, to remain alert, to anticipate any final threat. In the cabin, some of the men were helping the wounded, tending to the injured. Every movement was slow, deliberate, as if they were still trying to comprehend what was happening, what they had witnessed. Once the bulk of the evacuating group had been secured outside, we turned, moving back through the aircraft, methodical, thorough. We were the guardians of this airborne graveyard. Our mission had been a success, but the cost, and the responsibility, would be carried for a lifetime. The roar of the engines, that had moments before been a threat, now seemed to purr in a song of safety as the last of the terrorists were confirmed dead, and the hostages streamed out onto the tarmac. The news crews were already swarming, their cameras flashing, desperate to capture any angle of the spectacle. For Yaron and his team though, the show was far from over. The real performance was about to begin, the media blitz, the international scrutiny, the dissection of every move, every decision. They knew this, and it was a reality that Yaron felt pressing down on his chest, a weight heavier than the combat gear he still wore. The scene outside the plane was a blur of movement and sound, sirens, shouted commands, the excited chatter of rescued passengers. Inside, the cabin still reeked of cordite and fear. The air conditioning, thankfully now working, did little to dispel the metallic tang of blood. Yaron, still heart-pounding, moved methodically, supervising the final sweeps of the plane. His eyes darted, searching for any sign of a hidden threat. His mind a steel trap of details. The placement of bodies, the position of weapons, the precise trajectory of each bullet. He felt a deep weariness, a hollow ache where adrenaline had been pumping so furiously moments ago. The news crews, like vultures, descended upon the scene. They were the hungry audience now, the ones who would shape the narrative, who would cast them as heroes or, perhaps, as something else entirely. Yaron watched, his face impassive, as the first reporters began their breathless broadcasts, recounting the story of the daring rescue. Their words were often inaccurate, laced with hyperbole, painting a picture that was both exhilarating and profoundly unsettling. It was a sanitized version of the truth, glossing over the brutal efficiency of the takedown, the close quarters where life and death had become indistinguishable, and the immense pressure of those seconds. Back at the debriefing, the room was buzzing with a strange energy, a mix of exhilaration and relief. The mission was complete. The hostages were safe. They had succeeded, against odds that had seemed impossible. There was a sense of camaraderie, of shared experience that transcended words. But beneath the surface, Yaron saw a different reality. The haunted eyes of his comrades, the nervous laughter, the way some of them, like himself, seemed to retreat into themselves, trying to come to grips with the reality of what they had done. He wondered how much of his own mind would still be occupied by the images of that night, even when he tried to sleep. The accolades poured in medals, commendations, promotions. Operation Isotope was hailed as a triumph of Israeli ingenuity and courage. It was studied by military strategists and special forces units around the world, hailed as a watershed moment in hostage rescue tactics. The mechanics of the Sabina flight were now legendary. The white jumpsuits, the toolboxes, the cool efficiency, it all became a symbol of precision and daring. For a time, Yaron was celebrated as a hero. His face, along with those of his team members, was plastered across newspapers and magazines. Interviews were requested. He endured the relentless scrutiny, knowing that his every word and gesture were being evaluated, parsed, interpreted. But the fanfare, the adulation, eventually faded. The world moved on to the next crisis, the next headline. The details of Operation Isotope were filed away, a piece of military history. For Yaron, the memory of that day remained. A complex tapestry woven with threads of fear, courage, and a profound sense of loss. It was a moment that reshaped his understanding of duty, of sacrifice, and the true cost of war. He knew that he had done what he was trained to do, what he believed was right. However, the echo of the gunshots, the faces of the hostages, the cold weight of the dead terrorists, these were memories he would carry long after the cameras had gone silent. The humid air of the Sabina flight, once thick with the fear of the hostages, now carried the metallic scent of spent ammunition and the lingering aroma of stale coffee. A single shot, a final whisper of controlled violence, had signaled the end of the meticulously choreographed play. Now, the stage was empty. The actors gone, and the audience, the surviving hostages, were being ushered toward a new reality. For Yaron, the weight of the last few hours pressed down like a lead blanket. The adrenaline, once coursing through his veins, had begun to recede, replaced by a hollow ache, a profound sense of exhaustion that went beyond physical depletion. He watched as the last of the rescued citizens stumbled down the emergency chutes, their faces etched with a mixture of relief, shock, and a haunting awareness of what they had witnessed. He moved through the wreckage, the sterile white of the jumpsuit now spattered with crimson. His eyes scanned the cabin, the shattered remnants of what had been a symbol of ordinary life, now a testament to the brutal realities of terrorism and the unforgiving nature of a rescue mission. The air conditioning, once a source of comfort, now merely circulated the stale air and the ghosts of violence. He paused, his gaze settling on the lifeless forms of the terrorists, lying in the positions they'd fallen, their final acts of desperation forever frozen in time. The noise of the sirens grew louder as the first wave of first responders and journalists rushed towards the aircraft. Yaron felt a wave of nausea. He took a few deep breaths, forcing the memories of the recent chaos from his mind, and reminded himself that their job wasn't over until every threat was neutralized. The team moved methodically, searching for any hidden explosives, any vestige of danger that could reignite the horror. Later, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues, Yaron found himself standing near the edge of the perimeter. The glow of the setting sun cast long shadows, obscuring the faces of the crowd that had gathered at a distance. The initial surge of jubilation among the public had begun to fade, replaced by a more sober assessment of the events. He had seen the headlines, heard the accolades, felt the weight of the international attention that had been thrust upon them. But, inside, he was just a soldier, grappling with the echoes of his experiences. He stared out at the bustling airfield and the distant hum of activity. He knew that the operation was hailed as a triumph, a textbook example of how to manage a hostage situation. Yet, in that moment, as he stood at the precipice of a new dawn, a thought occurred to him. The best soldier is the one who knows when to be invisible. Because, while he'd just saved lives, the scars of the day would be an unwelcome reminder that the battles of the world are never truly over. The whispers of the departed, the echo of the gunfire, the lingering scent of smoke, these were the cost of a victory. A victory bought in macabre yet thrilling theater.